The Holocaust was an industrial process. Orchestrating the systematic murder of millions across an entire continent requires more than simple military force. It requires the active participation, or the calculated indifference, of an entire civilian population. To manufacture this compliance, the German state established the Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, directed by Joseph Goebbels. The internal logic of this ministry was exposed during the 1949 Ministries trial at Nuremberg, where the Reich press chief, Otto Dietrich, was convicted of crimes against humanity. The trial revealed a specific, terrifying function. The propaganda machine worked to biologically blunt the sensibilities of the German people to persecution and murder. Cognitive biases are mental shortcuts, allowing the brain to make quick decisions. But these shortcuts are vulnerable. By introducing specific stimuli, a regime can bypass rational thought entirely. We analyze these through three categories: social and attributional, memory, and decision-making biases. The RMVP realized that secure mass compliance required triggering these specific biological shortcuts, rather than relying on ideological repetition alone. They delivered these stimuli through the calculated, ubiquitous use of visual posters across every German public space. Reverse engineering these visual cues allows us to isolate the exact behavioral triggers used to turn an advanced society into an aggressor state. Following World War I, the German public faced the economic weight and national humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. The ministry's first operational objective was to eliminate rational debate regarding Adolf Hitler's actual policies. They utilized the halo effect, a social bias where a positive perception of a single trait spills over to alter the overall judgment of a person's character. Propaganda posters artificially triggered this effect by surrounding Hitler with divine lighting, winged birds, and floral wreaths. This was compounded by authority bias, the tendency to favorably judge an ambiguous situation if the directive comes from a perceived authority figure. The visual cues, a determined, shepherd-like stance, served as the specific stimulus required to trigger this obedience. Triggering the halo effect and authority bias simultaneously causes the brain to conflate political leadership with infallible moral righteousness. The deification of Hitler short-circuited logical political dissent, replacing it with unconditional religious adherence. While the leader was elevated, the propaganda machine identified a contrasting target to absorb the nation's anxieties. They employed selection bias, deliberately filtering reality to present only seedy, degenerate, or negative attributes of a specific group. This composition combines distinct groups into one monolithic threat. The multi-headed dragon bears the overlapping labels of Bolshevism, plutocracy, and Judaism. The chaotic visual composition forces the viewer into a defensive psychological posture, framing aggressive violence as necessary protection. This strategy feeds trait ascription bias, the tendency to view one's own group as complex while viewing outsiders as monolithic and predictable. The ministry used this bias to reduce millions of diverse individuals into a single, predictable enemy archetype. Saturated with these negative stimuli, the brain experiences the clustering illusion, detecting patterns of threat in everyday neighbors where none exist.
These visual biases biologically trained the general public's perception to immediately register innocent civilians as immediate existential threats. Propaganda was also used to justify atrocities against Germany's own disabled and mentally ill citizens. The ministry leveraged hyperbolic discounting, a bias where humans prefer an immediate payoff over a later, potentially more significant moral consequence. This poster engineers a hyper-rational economic argument. It contrasts the stark isolation of a figure with hereditary illness against a vibrant, healthy family. Bold displays of 5.50 Reichsmark anchor attention on the financial burden rather than the human being. This calculated stimulus framed state-sponsored murder as a necessary and immediate economic mercy. By reducing complex moral questions to simple math, hyperbolic discounting effectively neutralized the public's empathy and moral disgust. The regime consolidated its psychological hold by creating a visually defined Aryan ingroup. This exploits in-group bias, the tendency to provide preferential treatment and empathy only to those perceived to be within one's own tribe. Propaganda defined the in-group through idealized, healthy, hard-working family units. Family safety was visually intertwined with party loyalty, placing the citizens beneath the protective wings of the NSDAP eagle. This infrastructure relies on the bandwagon effect, or herd instinct, the evolutionary drive to adopt the behaviors of the majority to secure personal safety. The ministry deliberately manufactured the visual illusion of absolute, inescapable conformity to trigger this instinct. This herd mentality drove the public to actively participate in the destruction of opposing thought and cultural artifacts. This created projection bias. A silenced minority, overwhelmed by visual compliance, assumes that the rest of the population shares the state's radical values. The bandwagon effect completely paralyzed opposition. Individuals complied out of the terrifying perception that they were entirely alone. Examining the macro structure of this campaign reveals the core priorities of the RMVP. When we map the propaganda pillars against the triggered cognitive biases, a clear pattern emerges. The ministry focused its efforts on social and decision-making biases. There is a complete absence of memory biases, the shortcuts that alter how we recall the past. The Nazi apparatus was entirely focused on manipulating real-time social perception and enforcing immediate group action. The omnipresent bandwagon effect served as the crucial glue, making resistance seem socially impossible. The ideal propaganda poster acts as a precision-engineered weapon designed to short-circuit real-time logical processing. This matrix of psychological manipulation enabled the physical reality of the Holocaust. Hacking the evolutionary cognitive shortcuts of a population creates the social permission necessary for state-sponsored genocide to function. Because cognitive biases remain biologically hardwired into human nature, they leave modern populations highly vulnerable to these exact same mechanics. Breaking the stimulus loop requires recognizing the psychological lever being pulled. Resisting these effects requires identifying how a visual is attempting to process information for the viewer, rather than debating its literal claims. Education in visual epistemology and behavioral science provides a framework to identify these mechanics before they manifest as an aggressor state.